Assalamu alaikum everyone. Today I am joined by the well-known Pakistani journalist Ahmed Qureshi. Ahmed, thank you for joining us and taking the time out to give us your valuable analysis on the current geopolitical scenario. Today I would like to discuss Iran's increasingly anti-Pakistan rhetoric, and in the light of the latest developments in Afghanistan, I would like you to especially shed some light on the future of Pakistan-Iran relations and Taliban-Iran relations. This week we all saw that Indian media made ridiculous claims that Pakistani drones and fighter jets were fighting for the Taliban in Panjshir. And India's Republic TV was running the hashtag Pak Army for Rent. And then they claimed that Pakistan Air Force had dropped bombs through drones to help Taliban defeat the resistance in Panjshir. Thankfully, some in the international media studied and exposed the fake news in the Indian media. Now we all know and we have seen that there has been zero evidence of any Pakistani aircraft operating in Panjshir. Then why is Iran parroting the false reporting by Indian media and claiming that it will investigate Pakistan's involvement in Panjshir? Ahmed, what do you have to say to this hyped up anti-Pakistan rhetoric?
Right, thank you, Qudsiya, for this space. I think it's a very interesting discussion, and it's something that is evolving right now. It's very important to note when discussing this triangle, Iran, Taliban, and Pakistan, that all these three countries are actually being very, I would say, careful in how they're approaching this. So, as far as Pakistan is concerned, there has been no reaction officially at all, at any level, frankly, on what we saw coming out of, I would say, two briefings at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Iran in Tehran, I think on Sunday and again on Monday. And I think twice during this 1 week. So far the Taliban has been very quiet on those statements by the spokesman of the Iranian Foreign Ministry, and also Pakistan has not commented on this at all. In fact, in Pakistan, I don't think that the statements that were made by the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman were even covered by the Pakistani media. So there was totally a total blackout in the Pakistani media on those statements. And I think I recall I did see at least one major Pakistani English language newspaper covering this story on Monday, almost 4 days ago, on the very last page on a couple of columns. And the story coverage was basically, the title said something to the effect of, and this was the Express Tribune, which is the Pakistani partner of the New York Times, and they covered this story on the very last page and on 2 columns, and the title basically said, Iran strongly condemns Taliban's offensive in Panjshir. There was no mention at all and no reference in the story Pakistani newspaper to what the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson said on Pakistan's possible role. So now, when we're discussing this, we need to be also very specific on what actually was said during the said briefing at the Iranian Foreign Ministry. The spokesman basically did not volunteer a statement on an alleged Pakistani role in Panjshir. He was asked by one of the Iranian journalists, and the Iranian journalist question, ostensibly from the Iranian media coverage, was something to the effect of that there are reports on a possible Pakistani involvement, and there's a lot of talk and lots of tweets and social media posts, and there's a lot of many Afghans are talking about a possible Pakistani role in Panjshir in helping Taliban take over that region And the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson basically said, we've seen those reports, we're following them, we're very concerned, we will look into them and so forth. So basically it was not a very direct statement implicating Pakistan, what the spokesperson of the Iranian Foreign Ministry said. What was more direct, actually, and that's what really raised eyebrows in Pakistan. What was more direct is what was published by the Tehran Times, which is a state-linked newspaper in Iran. And not once, but several times, in fact, the Twitter feed of Tehran Times was very active and very direct in suggesting a Pakistani role in Panjshir, and as a matter of fact, it was sort of recycling the things that were being posted on social media, specifically on Twitter, with regards to a Pakistani possible role for Pakistan Air Force in Panjshir and a possible role for Pakistani drones in Panjshir. So now, basically, so what you have are basically three things coming from Iran. You have the briefing by the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Iran, which was very cautious. It did not volunteer a statement. It did not say directly that Pakistan is involved. It just answered a question by a journalist saying, yes, we've seen those reports, we're exploring them, we're looking into them, we're examining them. And sort of giving an indirect legitimacy theory that Pakistan is involved and is meddling in Afghanistan. And number two, we have the tweets by the Tehran Times. And the third, actually, and that's the more interesting one, this is a more direct one, which is an interview by the former president of Iran, President Ahmadinejad, an interview that he gave to a well-known journalist in India, where he was frankly direct, very direct. He was as direct as the Tehran Times. He was very direct about possible Pakistani involvement, and he talked about it very openly. But I should point out, to be accurate, I should point out he did speak or talk about Pakistan, but he did not name Pakistan. He did not use Pakistan, the word Pakistan, during the interview. He was making a very direct accusation about a possible Pakistani role in Panjshir and Pakistani meddling in Afghanistan, but he did not name Pakistan. He was careful not to disparage Pakistan or to sound insulting. So President Ahmadinejad was not insulting to Pakistan. He was careful not to directly criticize Pakistan. He just referred to the neighboring country, and then I think several times the Indian journalist did prod him to name Pakistan, and she named it, and she mentioned Pakistan. You're talking about Pakistan. You're saying that Pakistan is involved, so why not name the country? Obviously, President Ahmadinejad is a former president of Iran, and he's also, obviously, he's privy to diplomatic norms as a former president. It's beneath his, I would say, as a journalist.
But Ahmed, excuse me, I am interrupting you, but what I read on the news and what I saw on the Twitter, it said that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad said that Pakistani officers directly got involved in the war of Panjshir. He said, I have a piece of advice for Pakistan. What happened in Afghanistan will soon expand and take the grip of Pakistan. Countries which supported and designed this plot will face the consequences. I think this is a direct threat, don't you think? He's naming Pakistan and he's blaming us, and he's saying that you are going to bear the consequences. What do you have to say about this?
Okay, this is very interesting. I'm glad you brought this up, Qudsiya. So there are two parts to the interview. There's the part where he talks about evidence of Pakistani involvement, and then he talks about advice to Pakistan. And he did, he did refer to Pakistan explicitly. There's no question about this. He did not name. He was very careful. So you need to be very careful with the transcription of the interview, Qudsiya. During the interview, the harsher parts, he preferred not to name Pakistan. He referred to the neighboring country, the harsher parts. Where he was really very harsh, he did not name Pakistan. The part where he advised Pakistan as a neighbor, a friendly country, a brotherly country, he gave a sincere advice to Pakistan. That's where he named Pakistan. So I would overall, as a journalist, I would say it was a very bold interview. It was a very direct interview. It was a confrontational. There's no question about this. He was directly sending a very clear message. Obviously, he was playing the role of, I would say, he was a messenger. He was conveying what probably the Iranian government does not want to convey through existing officials of the government because of diplomatic protocols and being two neighboring countries, brotherly countries having strong relations with each other. Neither country, not Iran and not Pakistan, would like to escalate this, would like to see this escalate. But it's very obvious that the Iranian government, and I would say very specifically those parts of the Iranian government that deal with national security, the Iranian military, and specifically, of course, the IRGC, would like to convey a message, and they're trying to do this in a soft way. So far, you haven't seen anyone from the diplomatic side of the Iranian government or from the military side, either the armed forces of Iran or the IRGC, making any direct comments. Even the news outlet of Iran that made these comments is not known to be very close, for example, to the more hardline elements of the Iranian government, for example, the IRGC. Tehran Times is known to be closer sort of to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Iran, and the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs is generally, overall, it does follow the overall Iranian policy, but you have to be very careful about these subtleties. The Iranian Foreign Ministry usually adheres to diplomatic norms. They are less confrontational in conveying their messages as compared to, for example, the IRGC, and they have their own media outlets. They're very, very well-known media outlets, several news agencies, some newspapers, and those are very blunt and very harsh and very direct. Now, these outlets so far are quiet. These outlets are not explicitly criticizing Pakistan, although I did see in, I would say, one newspaper in Farsi which covered what happened in Panjshir, and it was very blunt and direct in accusing Pakistan of involvement in Panjshir. But that's one. I haven't seen, it's not yet a campaign yet in the Iranian media, especially the one which is closer, for example, to IRGC. So far, we have Tehran Times, but the very fact that the spokesperson of the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs did legitimize the idea that Pakistan is involved and we are examining, and then we have a former president of this level, of this caliber, President Ahmadinejad, and he was known to be very, very hawkish in his views and known to be closer to the more hawkish elements of the Iranian establishment, in particular the IRGC. So that would make what you say, Qudsiya, your question gives credence to your point that this is really a very direct accusation on Pakistan, and it is. There's no question about it. Iran, of course, when it comes to Afghanistan, is not known to be as compared to the Pakistani policy. For example, the Pakistani policy is very sort of soft and quiet, and even if there are tensions with any country other than India, Pakistani diplomacy and policies usually is to manage the tensions through diplomatic channels. You will not see media campaigns in Pakistan, for example, with any country, with the one exception, of course, and that's India. So India is a different case, but other than India, Pakistani media would not go out to launch a media campaign. But in Iran, when it came to Afghanistan back in the 1990s, the Iranian media, on those occasions where the Iranian and Pakistani policies really conflicted with each other on Afghanistan, the Iranian media was very blunt. I do recall in 1992 there were demonstrations and protests in Tehran in front of the Pakistani embassy in 1992. In at least one of those protests, it went as far as burning the Pakistani flag. Obviously, when those protests happen, usually it's Afghans who are refugees in Iran, and in particular in Tehran, who are at the forefront. Now, I cannot say for sure, sitting in Islamabad, I cannot say and confirm if the protest. I counted 2 protests that happened in Tehran over this 1 week. There were 2 protests. One was over the weekend, the last weekend, and the other one was yesterday in Tehran. And in both of these protests, frankly, the visuals, it was not possible to ascertain and confirm if it was only Afghan refugees who were involved in this protest, or were there also Iranian citizens who were involved in these protests. But overall, it is safe to say that protests of these nature targeting third countries in Tehran invariably have the express consent of either the Pasdaran, the IRGC, or they have some of the other paramilitaries which are responsible for internal security in various Iranian cities and towns. So it's normally with the consent of the authorities. Obviously, it's not possible to hold a protest in Tehran, for example, against a third country, and without some sort of approval or consent from the authorities. So it's fair to say right now that there are brewing tensions between Iran and Taliban on the one hand, and between Iran and Pakistan on the other hand, on the backdrop. But let's be very open about this, Qudsiya. The real interesting thing is that for Iran to have concerns is legitimate. Iran is a neighbor of Afghanistan, so I am not surprised that Iran would have a viewpoint on what's happening in Panjshir, for example. It's a legitimate thing for neighboring countries to have viewpoints. Pakistan has concerns, Iran has concerns, China has concerns, and the other neighbors of Afghanistan have concerns. So it's for Iran to have concerns. That part is normal. That part is understandable. What is actually interesting and different this time is the fact that the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson and Tehran Times both, and the ex-president Ahmadinejad openly saying, with the quote that you referred to, Qudsiya, just now, that there are Pakistani officers who are on the ground involved in Panjshir, for him to say this, and that he has evidence to that. For him to say that and promote this theory of direct Pakistani involvement, military involvement, deep inside Afghanistan, in Panjshir, to say that at this time actually aligns very, very clearly with the campaign that is going on in the Indian media against Pakistan, which was again very blunt and very open. And I think everybody saw BBC Reality Check, the fact-checking department of the BBC, the broadcaster, where they explain how the Indian media went about this campaign. And of course it's so obvious. They picked up some clips from some games and some old clips, and it was all fake. So everybody knows this by now. But so this is the interesting part for Tehran Times to recycle that campaign from the Indian media, not even social media. It's actually the mainstream Indian media, major news outlets like Republic and Times Now, and I think there's a third one. So for the Iranian Tehran Times to do this, and then for President Ahmadinejad, actually for an ex-president to say and refer to Pakistani officers being involved. So this really brings this tension to a very different and new level, and a serious level. So I conclude your answer to your first two questions. Yes, we have tensions right now. Yet Pakistan so far has not commented. It's been almost a week now, it's the sixth day now on that press briefing at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tehran. No reactions in Pakistan officially, and also no coverage whatsoever in Pakistani media, which means I think there is an effort in Pakistan probably to sort of not escalate this and not give credence to these campaigns and all of this chatter and talks. But
Right.
I'm sure that Pakistan, the concerned Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Pakistan, for example, and other departments of the Pakistani government who deal with foreign policy and strategic issues would be very, very concerned actually at these two things, the Tehran Times campaign and also what the former president Ahmadinejad actually said. This is new. This is totally new. It's unprecedented actually for any Iranian president to have come out to speak like this, even at the height of the Pakistani-Iranian indirect conflict on Afghanistan back in the 1990s. It became very, very serious. I would even say, as a journalist who went into that history, I would even say maybe the people in uniform on the Iranian side and people in uniform on the Pakistani side were not face to face, but were on the same front, face to face in Afghanistan behind their own proxies. So it was very serious back in the 1990s, specifically in 1998. But even then, yes, there were protests in Tehran. In one of the protests, there was a burning even of Pakistani flags. But there were never senior members of the Iranian government who came out to say what President Ahmadinejad this time has said in the Indian media. So this is different a little this time.
All right. I will discuss some of the points that you mentioned. So, Ahmed, you said that there was complete silence in Pakistan's media on Iran's anti-Pakistan rhetoric. Why was that? But you're also saying that Pakistani media never launches a campaign against any country like we see the Iranian media do or the Indian media do. They do it all the time. So,
Exactly. Exactly.
And you said that we saw the Iran Times practically recycle Indian media's campaign against Pakistan. It's unprecedented for any Iranian leader or president to come out so openly and blame Pakistan. So what has changed now? Why is this happening? And secondly, I want you to, you belong to media, so please shed some light on this. Why is there we saw a complete silence in Pakistan's media on this?
Okay, be brief and as clear as possible, because obviously this is a very complex situation and a very complex story. So let's take it in a very easy way, bit by bit, but in a quick way. I'll try to be brief so that we can also take some questions and comments, and I'm sure this is a very interesting and discussion, and there should be some very interesting perspectives and questions as well. So why the Pakistani media generally is not very, does not conduct coordinated attacks in campaigns. The only difference, of course, the only exception is India, obviously, because of the history that we have with India, and that's a whole different subject. And the only other example that I have is really possibly in some way the differences that emerged between Pakistan and the United States after 9/11 on Afghanistan. So I wouldn't call it a coordinated campaign in Pakistani media against the U.S. government, for example, but yes, there was, and you remember you've gone through all of that, and it was not really coordinated. It was criticism, and it was both media in the U.S. and Pakistan repeating their official positions and blaming the others. So there was a lot of blame game and so forth. But generally, Pakistani media or Pakistani governments are not known to have used Pakistani media for coordinated, organized campaigns against other countries. Again, as I said, with the one exception, and that is India, and both India and Pakistan have been involved both the medias in both countries. So it doesn't happen in Pakistan. But when it comes to Iran specifically, we do have a situation in Pakistan where, for various reasons, even an academic discussion on Iranian foreign policy, for example, has been something that it doesn't happen in Pakistan. So it's very rare in the Pakistani media, whether it's broadcast media or newspapers, or even in university discussions, for example, or seminars and so forth. It's very rare, actually, for Iranian foreign policy to come under discussion, or for there to be critique on. So you'd find very, very few articles in Pakistani media critiquing Iranian foreign policy, not necessarily to criticize Iran, or even for the purposes of just to understand what Iranian policy is and how it's impacting Pakistan. It doesn't happen. Why it doesn't happen in Pakistan? I think it has a lot to do with the things that happened in Iran after 1979, and the very fact that the Iranian government is not just any other government; it's a government by the clergy. So you have religious people and religious authorities in power in Iran. So when you're talking about Iranian government officials, you're not just talking about politicians, you're talking about clergy, people of religious significance. And that brings the religious dimension and the whole sectarian dimension, and that is something that in Pakistan, people try to avoid, obviously, because of the whole political aspect of this debate. So that's a good thing, I would say. That's a good thing. But the negative aspect of it is that there's a real need to understand Iran is a very important country, and Iranian policies have impact all across the regions around Iran, and certainly Pakistan. And it's very, very important in Pakistan to understand Iran and understand Iranian policy, and that is not happening. So that's a different topic. I leave it there. So that's one reason why you don't see much coverage in Pakistan, really, when it comes to Iran-related issues. Now, coming to your other points. The other thing is, I think that's one point. What's the other point, Qudsiya, you raised? You raised the point of the Pakistani media not covering this story at all. And then
the second point is, why now? Why, for the first time, any Iranian leader is so openly, bluntly speaking against Pakistan and
Exactly. Okay, so now to understand why Iran's Tehran Times would recycle the propaganda campaign in the Indian media on Pakistani fighter jets and drones in Panjshir, and then why would former President Ahmadinejad mention that there are Pakistani officers on the ground in Panjshir, to understand why this would be repeated, and to also understand why the spokesperson of the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs was very careful. He said, yes, we're examining it, but did not confirm it. To understand these three things, you have to understand one key point, and that is, why did very respectable, large, well-known Indian media houses dare pick up clips from games and old clips and pictures and broadcast them as evidence of Pakistani involvement in Panjshir, knowing that we have the internet and all of this will be exposed in no time, maybe in 24 hours, maybe in a week, but everybody will know very, very soon that this is fake. Why would very established Indian media outlets do this? And let's be very honest. India does have a very vibrant media scene, and they have media houses that go back several decades, 50, 60, 70 years. Many Indian journalists who work in these media outlets have strong connections with the international media. One of the Indian media outlets is working as a partner of CNN, and so forth. So why would they, editors in newsrooms in these very established media organizations, do this and take this risk of destroying their own credibility using material that they know will be debunked in no time, in a day, in a couple of days, in 3-4 days? Why? Why they did it is very simple. Because the purpose was not to, for example, sanction Pakistan, or the purpose was not to offer evidence of Pakistani involvement. The purpose was only one thing, and that is to confuse the people inside Afghanistan, in particular the educated Afghanis in major cities like Kabul and Jalalabad and Mazar-e-Sharif and Kandahar, and push them and provoke them to come on the streets and confront and go into a direct confrontation with Taliban soldiers on the ground, so that there could be images and videos of instability in Afghanistan and things getting out of control, and also to destabilize the new setup in Kabul. So this was basically an exercise in psychological warfare. The purpose of using fake images, yes, they would be debunked and exposed in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days, yes, but by that time, the people inside Afghanistan would already be overwhelmed by news and stories and rumors and theories about Pakistani soldiers on the ground in Panjshir and Pakistani drones and Pakistani jets taking part and bombing Ahmad Massoud and the Panjshiris. And this would provoke an ethnic clash. This would provoke infighting and would destabilize the country. So the purpose was to sort of bring the Afghanis on the streets. And it did happen, Qudsiya. You did see some very noisy protests in Kabul and probably in a couple of other places. And these could have, and if this campaign, this disinformation campaign on social media, had it continued and not been debunked as soon as it was, probably the psychological effect inside Afghanistan would have been even bigger. So basically the Indian media's aim was not really to establish a fact that Pakistan is really involved. The purpose was just to achieve this psychological objective of bringing the Afghanis on the streets, because you have to remember one thing, Qudsiya. Ahmad Massoud in Panjshir is a national hero. Ahmad Shah Massoud's family are sort of a royalty in Afghanistan. Afghanis respect Ahmad Shah Massoud. A lot of the people who grudgingly accepted Taliban's control of Afghanistan, grudgingly. They're not happy, but they're saying, okay, well, we have no choice. The other people escaped, so let's see how Taliban would fare this time. Those people would, yes, they have grudgingly accepted the Taliban, but if they begin to hear rumors that Pakistani soldiers are actually on the ground in Panjshir, that Pakistani drones are active and are bombing Panjshiris, that Pakistani jets are involved in bombings. So my last points was, the purpose was, the Indian media's purpose with this disinformation about Pakistani involvement was to bring the Afghanis on the streets and to make them angry about Pakistani boots on the ground in Panjshir and Pakistani drones and jets. And by the time these theories would be debunked, the Afghanis would be overrun with and awash with this disinformation, and the objective would be achieved. So now you understand.
So the damage was done by the disinfo campaigns. That was their main, purpose. By the time the truth came out, the damage was already done. So this
exactly. So now you come to former President Ahmadinejad and Tehran Times and the spokesperson of the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, for them to recycle this campaign and this theory of Pakistani involvement in Panjshir, it means that the gain is not to establish or give facts on Pakistani involvement, because there are no facts. There's no evidence. There's nothing. So the purpose is really not when President Ahmadinejad comes on an Indian channel and says, I have evidence that Pakistani officers are involved on the ground. Number one, he did not offer that evidence. Why is he saving that evidence? There is no evidence. Basically, the bigger chances there is no evidence. So, because if there were evidence, I think with this campaign alleging Pakistani involvement, some of that should have come out instead of these fake clips that have been debunked. So for him to say that, I think he's partaking and participating in the psychological campaign to bring the Afghans on the streets and make it difficult for the Taliban to hold on to power in Afghanistan and to sort of put the Taliban under pressure so that they don't firmly control the country and create some space for India, for Iran, for other countries, maybe if they're interested, to sort of meddle in the affairs. So in brief now, I conclude, I answer your question, Qudsiya, by saying that the Indian campaign was basically not about any real evidence of Pakistani involvement. It was about psychological impact, bringing the Afghans on the streets, telling them that Panjshiris are being bombed by Pakistani jets and drones, and you have to come and defend the honor and bring the Afghanis on the streets. That was the aim. And for Tehran Times, for example, and more importantly for somebody of the stature of former President Ahmadinejad to say that he has evidence or he has seen evidence of Pakistani officers being on the ground, he's really basically playing into this psychological game of bringing the Afghanis on the streets and creating doubts in their minds about Pakistani boots on the ground inside Afghanistan, and sort of countering the Pakistani narrative, where Pakistani officials keep saying, we have no favorites in Afghanistan, we're not meddle inside Afghanistan, we will not do this. Basically, when Ahmadinejad says, well, we have evidence of Pakistani officers, this is creating doubts inside Afghanistan in the minds of Afghan politicians, who are involved in mission where diplomatic, psychological, information warfare, all of these things are being deployed in this game around Afghanistan. Very interesting situation.
All right. So we saw that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Iran, talked about investigating foreign involvement in Afghanistan. But the interesting part is that even Pakistan can ask them, about the involvement in Afghanistan and Syria, in Lebanon and Palestine, in so many other places. And how can we forget the Indian spy, Kulbhushan Yadav, who was operating from Chabahar, Iran. But Pakistan never blamed Iran for direct espionage or for violating the, sovereignty of Pakistan. So I have now received some very interesting questions, and let's move towards the questions. First question is from, this is someone Fajad on Twitter, and he says, why doesn't Pakistan respond to Iran's untruthful accusations on Afghanistan? Why is there total silence from the civilian and military leadership?
Yeah, well, it's a long discussion why there's a silence, but generally Pakistan prefers to manage conflict quietly. So Pakistan prefers, this is the Pakistani style of managing conflict. With Iran, specifically with Iran, Pakistan has been trying to not get involved in Iran's crosshairs and keep Iran busy in other places in Afghanistan or the Middle East, and not draw the Iranian bull's attention toward Pakistan, so as not to come into Iran's crosshairs. Iran has, the Iranian government after 1979 has a very, very good experience in managing conflict with multiple actors. They are very good at this. They are very good at using multiple tools to apply pressure on the countries with whom they have conflict. And the Iranian government, in particular the IRGC, are very, very good at that. Pakistan has its own set of problems, a number of issues with India, with Afghanistan, some of course also on the Pakistani-Iranian border situation, number one. And number two, at this very moment, it actually goes against Pakistan's interest to give too much attention to anyone who is shouting and saying, well, Pakistan is involved on the ground in Panjshir. So for Pakistan right now, to get into a diplomatic spat and tit for tat, and he said, she said, with the Iranian foreign ministry. For example, for these two foreign ministries, the Pakistani and the Iranian, if they were to respond to each other, or for the Pakistani media to start responding to Tehran Times, for example, or for somebody to respond to President Ahmadinejad, this would actually draw the attention to the whole subject of Pakistani meddling, the alleged Pakistani meddling in Afghanistan, and that's, I would assume, I don't know this, but I'm assuming that the Pakistani authorities and the government would not want to draw the international attention. Now, if there was anybody from Pakistan's government or the military who would issue in a statement responding to what President Ahmadinejad said about Pakistani officers on the ground, for example, if there was a response from Pakistan, obviously this would be a huge, big story internationally. And instead of focusing on the things that Pakistan wants to focus on with regards to Afghanistan, Pakistan wants the international community to engage the Taliban, to engage Afghanistan and move forward. For Pakistan to get off that track and start responding to what President Ahmadinejad said, the very straightforward accusation about Pakistani military involvement, that would draw the international media's attention, and the whole narrative on Afghanistan would shift to this point. And because Iran is a newsmaker, and obviously these days Pakistan is also a newsmaker, and for these two countries to fight it out diplomatically on Afghanistan would be a huge, huge story. I think all of these reasons, I'm assuming, as a journalist who has very closely studied Pakistani methodology when it comes to diplomacy and conflict management, I think Pakistani officials would be saying, let's not focus on this. If we were to respond to them, this would give them what they want. They want more focus and more discussion on alleged Pakistani meddling in Afghanistan. Let's not give them that. Let's focus on what's important and ignore it and let it die out. The stories on the media have been debunked. The fake news, the clips have been debunked, and these statements and these campaigns will also. Now, for President Ahmadinejad, if he were not to release the evidence that he says he has a virtual death on its own, so I think that would be the Pakistani reasons. I assume, I'm not speaking on behalf of the government. I frankly, even on this very topic, I have not spoken. Usually, we journalists speak to government officials. We try to understand how they're thinking about a certain story. But I'm not surprised really that no government official really, even off the record, is ready to speak on what happened or what on what President Ahmadinejad said or what Tehran Times said. So there's a complete silence in Pakistan. I wouldn't call it silence. I would call it death by silence. They would like to ignore it and let the story die out. A natural death.
All right. Very interesting answer, Ahmed. Now we have another question from Syed Ahmed Ali Shah, and he's saying, what favors can Pakistan get in terms of trade and regional security from our relationship with Afghan Taliban?
Okay, so it's very important to understand that Pakistan has no choice. It's not a question of what benefits we can get from Taliban. It's a question is the whole world has no option in Afghanistan except the Taliban. Why? Because Pakistan actually, a lot of people don't know this, and I was very surprised when I came to know this. So let me share this with you. I was very surprised when actually I came to know that it is Pakistan's policy, diplomatically, militarily, intelligence, to support the government of President Ashraf Ghani, despite the issues and problems that Pakistan had with some members, key members of the Ashraf Ghani government. So Pakistan was actually supporting Ashraf Ghani's government to reach a compromise which would have given some ministries to the Taliban in a future coalition government in Kabul. And Ashraf Ghani would have remained there, and Pakistan was supporting them. In fact, Pakistan was training a few, not a lot, but a few, but again, it's very important, a few of the officers from the special forces of the Afghan army, and also from their commandos and their intelligence units. So Pakistan was supporting Ashraf Ghani's government because we were working, I assume, with the United States, and this is what the Western partners of Afghanistan also wanted, for Pakistan to support the existing system. So Pakistan, despite having a very, very good relationship with the Taliban and facilitating Doha talks and everything, Pakistan was actually not supporting a Taliban takeover of Kabul. Pakistan was supporting a coalition government where people in Ashraf Ghani's government and people in Taliban would jointly create a future government that would be a coalition government. And Taliban would not take over Kabul per se the way it did on August 15th. That was not the plan. So it is actually, and it's because of the Ashraf Ghani people and the other Afghan politicians who were in government in the past 2 decades, because they fled Afghanistan, because they escaped, because they were not ready to withstand and continue negotiations, and they were actually trying to fail the effort, scuttle the efforts of both Pakistan and also the US government. This is very, very important to understand that Ashraf Ghani's government and the people who are in power in Kabul were actually working against the policy and the interests, not just of Pakistan or the Afghan people. They were working against the direction of the US government. The US government wanted them to, both the Trump administration and also Biden administration, both wanted President Ashraf Ghani's government to work with the Taliban and jointly stabilize Afghanistan. And Ashraf Ghani's people, until the very last moment, tried to fail this effort. And eventually, instead of signing a deal and in an organized way, they fled and left Afghanistan in chaos. So Pakistan's first preference was actually a joint government, and they supported Ashraf Ghani. But when they fled, Pakistan, the US, everybody internationally, no option except to see Taliban in power. Because, see, you have a huge country like Afghanistan. Who would go in there and stabilize that country? Would the US Army come back and stabilize Afghanistan? Would NATO do this? Chinese send their military and stabilize Afghanistan? Would the Iranians send their military to stabilize Afghanistan? Would Pakistan send its military units to secure Afghanistan and its borders? Nobody would do it. So who else is left for the international community to work with? The only power on the ground that could do this is the Taliban. And the only thing you can do is to work with them and hope that they would moderate their behavior and work with the international community. So when somebody asks me a question, what benefit would Pakistan get from Taliban? It's really not a question to ask, because frankly, Pakistani officials have no option. If I go to speak, and I did ask some Pakistani officials, well, I'm doing a research, I'm writing a story, can you help me with this point? What is really our benefit seeing the Taliban in power in Afghanistan? And mostly what I heard is, you know what, this was not our first choice. We supported Ashraf Ghani. He fled. He disappointed us. He disappointed Washington. He disappointed NATO. He ran away. He got all the money he could get. He had a great military, great equipment. He could have withstood his ground. He could have fought. If the Taliban were fighting, he could have fought, because there was equipment. There was lots. The Afghan army was capable, actually, of at least holding back for a few days or for a few weeks. They did not. There was not even fighting, really, this time. They simply laid down their arms and they fled. And it was mostly a peaceful takeover by Taliban. Mostly peaceful, except for maybe 2 or 3 places. So overall, before we discuss what benefit Pakistan gets from having Taliban in power in Kabul, the question is, does Pakistan have a choice? It's not a question of what benefit Pakistan gets from seeing Taliban. Pakistan does not have the option of dislodging the Taliban from Kabul or ending the Taliban. It's not a choice that Pakistan can make. These are Afghan citizens, these are Afghan people. They have to, it's their country, whether it's the Ahmad Shah Massoud or it's anybody, Ashraf Ghani or Taliban. And if the Afghans themselves, cannot eliminate each other, it's not, I don't think it's right to expect Pakistan, for example, to eliminate Taliban. The United States could not eliminate Taliban for 20 years. For Pakistan to do that would be fully considering that Pakistan is a right next door neighbor, and we have the probably more Pashtun in Pakistani Pashtun actually than the Pashtun in Afghanistan. So what Pakistan, the only option Pakistan has is deal with the Taliban, whether we get a benefit out of seeing Taliban in Kabul or not. That's the option, not just we, but everybody, including Iran, including everybody internationally, including China. That's the only option we have.
All right. So what I get from you is you're saying that Pakistan does not have the option to dislodge Afghan Taliban from Afghanistan, or for that matter, any other party which is in Afghanistan.
Exactly.
Now we have a question from Wasif Kazmi, and he's saying, why is it Pakistan's responsibility to look after the region? Why aren't other countries doing enough to make the region stable?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question, Basit. Well, it's not Pakistan's responsibility, obviously. Pakistan, if you carefully see the statements coming out of Pakistani officials, they keep saying, including yesterday when the Pakistani foreign minister did a media briefing with the foreign minister. One line that the Pakistani foreign minister is repeatedly saying since August 15 is that Pakistan will work with its international partners on Afghanistan. Pakistan will not go it alone. Pakistan will not pursue a lonely, single policy on Afghanistan and force everybody in the region or in the world to follow that policy. Pakistan will not do that. So, for example, when it comes to a possible recognition of Taliban rule in Kabul, Pakistan will not do it alone. Pakistan will only do it if the international partners of Pakistan come along. So Pakistan will not go it alone. So it's definitely not a Pakistani responsibility. Pakistan is not taking. I haven't seen or heard anybody here in Islamabad in positions of authority who would say, you know what, we will do this and we will force the whole region to follow and we will force the world to follow. It cannot happen. The only thing Pakistan is saying is that we will do what the rest of the world would do and we will work with our partners, number one. And number two, yes, Pakistan is advising working with the Taliban. That's the Pakistani position. Why? Because nobody has an option. And I think Pakistani officials are really, really worried about Afghanistan getting destabilized and for Afghanistan to have a refugee crisis, number one, and a civil war, number two. Pakistan is really very worried about this. Pakistan does not want a repeat of what happened in the 1980s with millions of Afghans coming Pakistan's side. And so Pakistan is, number one, will not go it alone. Pakistan does not claim to have a responsibility. Pakistan wants others to be involved and share this responsibility. And that's the reason why you saw the Pakistani National Security Advisor and the Pakistanis travel to Washington, D.C. And convince the Americans after the withdrawal not to abandon Afghanistan completely. Yes, you have withdrawn, but we will help you. Pakistan will help you. Keep engaged, stay in Afghanistan in some way, work with the Taliban. This was the Pakistani policy. So I don't think this impression is correct that it is Pakistan's responsibility. It is not Pakistan's. Pakistan is saying it's not our responsibility. Pakistan is saying we will work with our partners on this.
All right. And now we have a question from, this is someone Malik on Twitter. And he's saying that please shed some light on Iran versus Pakistan conflict in the 1990s in Afghanistan for the newer generation like us. And will Pakistan attend Taliban oath-taking ceremony? And what's the perceptive about, I think he wants to say, what's the perception about recognizing Taliban's regime in Islamabad and Pindi?
Right, so recognition of Taliban in Kabul. So far, what we hear from Pakistani officials is that Pakistan will not do it alone. Pakistan will work with them, obviously, because they are the authority, because you have an interim government now, a transitional government, waiting for the permanent final government to take shape and be inducted. But Pakistan will work with whoever is there in Kabul. So as far as recognition is concerned, it's very clear. What you hear in Pakistan is from everybody in government is that Pakistan will not go it alone. Yes, Pakistan is in favor of engaging the Taliban because that's the only choice. Pakistan is saying, yes, we should do it, but not alone. Pakistan will deal with them, will give them help, assistance, humanitarian aid, help them with flights and so forth. But when it comes to recognition of the government, that decision would only come in coordination with Pakistan's international partners, foremost, of course, the United States, but also NATO countries, other important countries in the region, China, Russia, and others. So that's for the recognition. As far as the oath-taking ceremony, I haven't heard really anything about oath-taking ceremonies yet, because I think the Taliban officials are in a fix and they're facing a problem. And the problem is that a lot of the people internationally are not happy with even though this is a transitional government, it's a temporary government, but a lot of the Afghans and a lot of the people internationally are not happy with some of the names in this government. So for them, I think, I'm not sure if the neighboring countries of Afghanistan right now would be ready to participate in an oath-taking ceremony where some of these people would be present. Although I must add that these members of the interim government in Kabul right now met American interlocutors many times, and U.S. delegations had no problem meeting them, and other international delegations as well, the Russians, the Chinese, Iranians, and others, the Turkish government, the Qatari government. Nobody had any problems dealing with these some of these names, which are being now said to be problematic right now because of either they are sanctioned by the UN, are in the sanctions list, or are considered to be linked to terror groups like Al-Qaeda and so forth. So the point is, so the oath-taking ceremony is I would assume, there's no news yet, I cannot confirm it, but I'm assuming from what I follow is that you also don't see the Afghan Taliban yet talking about any oath-taking ceremony. There's no talk about oath-taking ceremony now. I'm assuming that the oath-taking ceremony is now deferred for a future date, possibly when the final government takes shape in Kabul, which is a coalition government, an inclusive government that is acceptable to most Afghans. So until that happens, I personally believe, I might be wrong, by the way, but I'm assuming that we may not see an oath-taking ceremony anytime soon.
All right. Now we have a question from Fahad Asif, and he's asking, Pakistan has for a long time tried to balance between the Iranian and Saudi camps. This attitude by Iran will push up public perceptions against them. Do you think Iran will act as India's proxy since India has lost its leverage in Afghanistan?
Okay, that's a very interesting question, Qudsiya. Now, somebody also asked, by the way, about Pakistani-Iranian conflict in Afghanistan in the 1990s. So I'm just reminding you, we can cover this a little later if there is time. So on this question, Pakistan has tried to balance between Iran and Saudi Arabia and whether this Iranian position would tilt Pakistani public opinion against Iran in that Saudi-Iranian balance. A very interesting question. Now,
we can discuss it in detail some other time, but briefly you can answer it right now.
Yes, very briefly I would say this. See, you have to understand one thing. Me as a journalist, very closely studied Iranian policy post 1979. I'm not, as a journalist, I'm not really an expert on pre-1979 Iranian policy. Honestly, I do know a lot about it from my work and research, but I'm not an expert on it. But I have studied Iranian policy and foreign policy in specific very deeply post-1979. And post-1979, we need to be very clear about something. In this region, as far as India is concerned, Iran is the closest country in terms of military, diplomatic, and intelligence cooperation. Iran and India have a very relationship. And as a matter of fact, they have a defense treaty or pact that dates back to 2003. And they have a defense agreement, defense pact between the two countries. It's actually an alliance between these two countries.
Ahmed, your voice just cut off. What word did you use? What kind of relationship Iran and India have?
Yes, let me I hope it's clear now. You can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I was just saying, very briefly, I was saying that Iran and India probably happen to be very, very close, and I would say they're probably, in terms of diplomacy, military, and intelligence, probably they're the closest countries in this region of ours, where Pakistan and Afghanistan are located. So when you look at this very region, India and Iran, post-1979, are very close countries, and they have a defense pact that dates back to 2003. And they have, in 2003, Iran and India actually entered a defense agreement where they agreed to work together on diplomacy, on policies, on intelligence, and on military. It's not a secret. It was a very open agreement, and it was signed in Tehran, and it was ratified in Tehran. It was discussed in the media, so it's not a secret. It's cooperation between two countries. So these two countries have very, very close relationship. Apart from that, in 1990s, Iran and India in 1990s were immediate allies in Afghanistan. And from 1996 till 2001, and I would even say up until maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I would say until 2015, Iran and India were supporting the Northern Alliance, the former Northern Alliance. In the 1990s, both these countries were supporting the Northern Alliance in the fight against Taliban. And obviously, Taliban was supported in a big way by Pakistan, by the United States, by some of the Gulf countries, by Saudi Arabia, by the UAE. There was recognition by Saudi Arabia and UAE of the Taliban government on Pakistan's request. And Pakistan was in recognition of the Taliban government, obviously. The U.S. government at that time was dealing very, very closely with the Taliban government, although there was no diplomatic recognition of Taliban government because of the human rights issues. So, there are many proxies in Afghanistan who are backed by India and also backed by Iran. And although they have been weakened now after coming to power after 9/11, in fact, some of the even American national security experts do write in some of the books that the proxies who were backed by Iran and by India in Afghanistan actually helped the United States in the war in Afghanistan to occupy Afghanistan and dislodge the Taliban. So many of the proxies of Iran and proxies of India came to power in Kabul with American help in 2002, and they were in power. And obviously, the U.S. government was aware of the fact that the Iranian government at that time and also India cooperated in this fight against the Taliban, cooperated with the U.S. government, with the U.S. military. So to conclude this very complex point, Iran and India have a very, very close relationship. And as far as Afghanistan is concerned, they are allies in Afghanistan. There's no doubt about this. What Pakistan has been trying to do recently in Doha talks is to break this Iran-India alliance. Pakistan has been trying to break it. How Pakistan was trying to take Iran on board. And I think Pakistani government did a fairly good job of trying to convince Tehran to not repeat the history of 1990s and go along with the Indian policy in Afghanistan, and instead cooperate with Pakistan and also indirectly cooperate with the United States, which Tehran, by the way, did. And I think Tehran did this in order to sort of win favor also in Washington, because they have very difficult negotiations going on with regards to the JCPOA and the Iran nuclear deal. And I think there was hope. I'm assuming from analyzing the Iranian behavior recently after Doha, I was basically saying that that Iran and India actually had been allies in Afghanistan. In fact, the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 and the dislodging of the Taliban would not have been successful for the United States without boots on the ground. As you recall, you remember, the U.S. actually sent very little an invasion per se, like it was in Iraq. So basically, the reason the U.S. succeeded was because of indirect Iranian and Indian cooperation through the Northern Alliance, who were mostly at that time, mostly Indian and Iranian proxies, mostly the warlords. Of course, the things have changed completely, and on the day the Taliban took over Kabul, most of the leaders and important figures in the Northern Alliance, surprisingly, were in Islamabad. And they stayed in Islamabad for about 2 weeks after the Taliban takeover, and they were trying to negotiate, while sitting in Islamabad, negotiate a sort of a coalition government or inclusive government in Kabul with Taliban. So it's very important to understand when we talk about Pakistan-Iran relations with regards to Afghanistan, that there has been competition between these two countries back in the 1990s, and that Iran is very strongly allied with India as far as Afghanistan is concerned. And obviously the reasons are very clear. Both India and Iran would not like to see a lot of Pakistani influence in Afghanistan for various reasons. Whatever those reasons are, that could be a long academic discussions. But it is Indian interest and it is an Iranian interest not to see a very strong Pakistani influence in Afghanistan. At the same time, of course, both these countries are trying to expand their sphere of influence inside Afghanistan. And I do recall speaking to a former Pakistani ambassador in Kabul back in the 1990s who said that in 1996, when Taliban came to power in Kabul for the first time, I hope I'm still here and you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. And I do recall, this is a very important piece of information, by the way. This gentleman who is now deceased, and he was a senior Pakistani diplomat, he said that in 1996, when Taliban took over Kabul, Pakistan actually approached Iran and offered a joint effort to support the Taliban in Kabul in exchange for securing both the Pakistani and the Iranian interest in Kabul. And I think there were serious negotiations between Islamabad and Tehran to work together and support the Taliban back in 1996. And at some point during those negotiations, the Iranian government at that time was ready and willing to explore the possibility of supporting the Taliban back in 1996 in exchange for accommodating some Afghan warlords who are closer to Iran and who you could say were Iran's proxies. So in a way, people that Pakistan likes, you could call them Pakistan proxies in a way, but in they were not exactly Pakistani proxies. People like Gulbuddin Hikmatyar and others. Pakistan was, and there were, of course, there was, of course, Taliban as well.
We can say that they were friendly towards Pakistan.
Exactly, they were very close to Pakistan. So in a way, people who are close to Pakistan, people who are close to Iran, would be part of the government in Kabul. Iran at one point ended those talks and conveyed to Islamabad very politely, thanking Islamabad for the offer to join in supporting the Kabul government in exchange for accommodating its people in the new Afghan government. But Iran basically said, thank you, but no, we are not interested in this offer, and we prefer to stay with the Northern Alliance.
So they basically declined?
They declined, basically, yeah. They basically declined this offer, and they went to support the Northern Alliance. It was after that Pakistan actually approached other international players to then come forward and support the Taliban government, including, of course, the U.S. government, including many Arab countries, many Western countries, and eventually only two countries agreed to recognize the Taliban, and that was the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. So only these two countries came forward. The U.S. Declined also politely to recognize the Taliban, but accepted. This basically happened in the 1990s between Pakistan and Iran, and at this point, I think there should be no doubt that Iran and India's perceptions with regards to Afghanistan. Now, India and Iran might differ on other things. They might differ on other things. The Iranian government is very disappointed with India on American sanctions. India abided by the American sanctions. Iran expected India to take a stand and not accept American sanctions on Iran and continue to buy Iranian oil. India did not do that. Iranian government was upset at that. But when it comes to Afghanistan, Iran and India are on the same page. And that's the reason why, for example, when Pakistan began and launched the economic corridor, the CPEC, with China at Gawadir, Iran wasted no time in launching the Chabahar project, linking it to Afghanistan with the Indian help, with the main objective, of course, being to reduce Pakistan's chances of increasing its influence in Afghanistan. So it's a game of interests. It's a game of countries. But Qudsiya, there's a very important point. Pakistan and Iran never competed in Afghanistan before 1979. This is a very important point. Pakistan and Iran actually probably were the closest two countries in terms of intelligence and military before 1979. So there was a very, very close cooperation between Pakistan and Iran before 1979. And Afghanistan was never a point of contention between Tehran and Islamabad before 1979. The whole calculus changed after 1979 for many, many reasons. For whatever reasons, the new government that came in Iran after 1979 had active interest in multiple regions outside Iran in the neighborhood, and one of them, of course, was Afghanistan as well, and it was a different perspective, and it changed completely. So it's very important to understand, Qudsiya, that Pakistan and Iran did not historically fight over Afghanistan. They did not. This situation emerged not even in the 1980s, because after the Iranian Revolution, the new revolutionary people in Tehran, the government, were busy in establishing themselves, in controlling the country. They had a war with another neighbor, with Iraq, and it was a very difficult situation for them. So they were not really very concerned about Afghanistan in the 1980s. So the government, Tehran, really completely neglected Afghanistan in the 1980s. It was completely Pakistan that was involved in Afghanistan in the 80s, of course, with the West, with the United States and with the pro-West allies worldwide involved in Afghanistan, and Iran was completely cut off out of Afghanistan. It was not interested in that mess because Iran was busy in establishing the new revolution, establishing itself, and also busy, of course, in the Gulf and busy in Iraq as well with the war.
You have given some very interesting bit of information here, Ahmed. We also have to wrap up this session, but I still have a few questions. This is from Essen, and he's asking, what do you think, will Taliban succeed in their mission in terms of governance in Afghanistan? Can they be a threat to the Indian government in regards to Kashmir?
Okay, very interesting question. See, let's talk India and Taliban. The Taliban have changed their tone with regards to India. This is a very key point. Taliban has changed their tone toward India. And India has changed its tone on Taliban privately. Publicly, the Indian media is launching campaigns against the Taliban and have very negative coverage of Taliban officially and in the media. But privately, Indian diplomats are in contact with the Taliban. As a matter of fact, when the Indian government decided to empty and end its diplomatic mission in Kabul and leave it after the Taliban takeover, the Taliban actually informally in Kabul approached the Indian embassy in Kabul and asked them to stay because the Russians are staying, the Pakistanis are staying, the Chinese are staying, some others probably are staying. So, why leave? And we will give you protection. But it was the Indian government's decision to leave. So when India decided to leave, Taliban actually provided security and a protocol escort. There was a Taliban escort for Indian diplomats from the Indian embassy to the was the right thing to do diplomatically. It's like between any other two countries when one government gives diplomatic protocol to the diplomatic staff of another country when they're leaving. So that was really very surprising. So there's a change of tone in Taliban's approach with India, and there's information about at least two meetings in Doha before Taliban takeover in Kabul. There were at least two very high-level meetings in Doha in Qatar between a very senior high-level Indian delegation and Taliban. So the idea right now, of course, I don't have first-hand information as a journalist. The information I have is really from open sources and maybe some from some sources in government, maybe Pakistani government, and some other sources in the region. In Doha, for example, some of our colleagues in the media that we speak to regularly. And the information is that there is communication between Taliban and the Indian government, and it's a positive communication. It's not acrimonious. It's not bad. It's very healthy. But it's not very close, obviously. And the reason I'm saying it's not very close because otherwise we would have seen a different tone and language from the Indian media with regards to Taliban. We don't see that. I don't know why. Maybe it's because the Indian government thinks that Pakistan is behind the Taliban, or maybe because they think Taliban are proxies of Pakistan, which is the conventional wisdom and thinking in many places. But whatever the reason, there is a tone of language and a change in tone between India and Taliban. With regards to Kashmir, I think the Taliban are very careful in talking about Kashmir. They're not. The only thing I've seen so far with regards to Taliban and Kashmir is one orphan statement by one senior Taliban spokesperson. I think it was Sohail Shaheen, where he was quoted by mainly Pakistani media saying that Kashmiris are our Muslim brothers and we support our Muslim brothers everywhere, and it's not surprising. So it was a very diplomatic statement. I mean, which is very mature also of the Taliban. So you have to look at it from various angles. Taliban are being very careful with their language. They are saying the right things. They don't want to alarm their neighbors and countries in the region. India is not an immediate neighbor, obviously, but it's in the region, and it had close relations with many Afghan warlords. So the Taliban are trying to be very careful. They don't want to incite or provoke some neighboring countries into getting involved into a proxy war, a civil war, a repeat of what happened back in the 1990s. So I think we need to watch the language that Taliban are using when they speak about India or anything related to India, and also see how the Indian officials are talking about Taliban. You don't see them talking very negatively about Taliban, but their media is being very critical. At the same time, for example, Iran has a very good working relationship with the Taliban, but at the same time, they condemned very strongly Taliban's offensive in Panjshir, and they allowed a couple of protests in Tehran. So it's a very calculated sort of approach by everyone. Everyone is being very calculative, including the Taliban. So when Taliban is asked by a Pakistani journalist to give a statement on Kashmir, Suhail Shaheen is very diplomatic. He says, well, it's very natural for us to support Muslims everywhere, so, it's very natural that we will support also the people of Kashmir. That was a very diplomatic thing to say. It's almost the same thing that many other Muslim countries say.
So basically, they do not want any kind of confrontation with India or any other country at the moment.
That's so far, yes, so far.
Okay,
yes,
there's another question that's not directly related to our topic, but just very briefly answer this question. It's by Saqib K. Khan, and he's asking, will Taliban deviate from their strict Islamic ideology under pressure from the West, especially on women's rights issues?
I think it's very clear that the Taliban have already deviated from their interpretation of religion and Sharia. And they have. It's very clear. I think as a neutral watcher, for me at least, it's very clear that they have deviated. They have not deviated a lot, but whatever amount they have deviated so far is really huge. If somebody had told me early this year that Taliban would agree to sit with female anchors and do interviews in Kabul, in studios in Kabul, I would not have imagined that. Or if somebody would have told me that CNN female reporters and Al Jazeera reporters would be doing packages and reports from the streets of Kabul and right in front of Taliban soldiers, I would not have imagined that possible. Obviously, the Taliban are trying to sort of deviate a little bit. For example, at one point they did not allow girls and women at all to study, and now they are just they're nudging a little backwards by, for example, allowing female students at universities on the condition that there is a sort of a separator in the classroom between male students and female students and so forth, a segregation of some kind. So it is a deviation. I know it's not a huge deviation. It's not a big deviation. It's not what many of the critics of the Taliban expect of them, but it is a deviation. It is the Taliban has allowed many protests by women activists in Kabul and outside Kabul. Unheard of, unexpected. Yes, they were harsh. There are some videos where they pushed back some of these women. They tried to intimidate some of these women protesters. But they allowed, by and large, they allowed these protests by women activists to move forward and did not crack down on them so far. Why? Maybe because they're afraid that the international media is present and these will be captured on media and broadcast worldwide, and that would bring pressure on Taliban. Maybe, yes. But it shows that the Taliban, I don't know if they have come under pressure or not. Maybe it's because they have younger Taliban now. Don't forget, Qudsiya, don't forget that there are many young, very, very smart, English-speaking Taliban now in positions of authority, not at the very top, but at the second, third, and fourth tiers of Taliban. I will remind you that in the first week after the takeover of Kabul by Taliban, I think some senior member of the political office of Taliban in Kabul gave an interview to Al Jazeera English. And I was surprised when I saw that interview. I mean, there was a young Taliban in the typical Taliban dress, quote, the way they are dressed up with the turban, with everything, the beard and everything, and yet he was a very smart young man, and he was speaking in a very good English, and not just English, but actually even there was a hint of American English in his language. And he was defending Taliban, and he was defending Taliban policies. So you have younger Taliban also within the Taliban, and this would obviously change some of the perspective of the Taliban. Also, do not forget that Taliban have had an office in Doha, Qatar for a long, long time. Now, Doha, Qatar is a very cosmopolitan city, Doha, and it's open. You have everybody there from all over the world. The Taliban have met the Americans for many, many times, the Russians, the Chinese, and everybody else, and they're exposed to the world. In Doha, for example, where let me just give you this and conclude with this very, very interesting point. Do you know that the office of the Taliban in Doha, in Qatar, is just a stone throw away, meaning very, very close to the largest American military base in the entire Middle East. In fact, the very base from where many of the drones were operated that actually attacked Taliban positions in previous years inside Afghanistan, Al-Udeid air base in Doha, Qatar. And the Taliban lived there in their office right next to the American military base for many, many years. Although there was no interaction, obviously, between the military and the Taliban, but they had an office there. And also, do not forget that Doha, Qatar is, although they do not have diplomatic relations with Israel, but Israeli economic and sporting delegations regularly visit Doha. And in fact, some of the major Israeli media organizations have presence in Doha as well. And some of them even attended Taliban press conferences and so forth. So Taliban have become very worldly. They have interacted with the world. I am not sure, of course, obviously, I cannot speak with authority on behalf of Taliban. I don't know. I'm sitting in Islamabad, but we are the closest capital to Kabul in Islamabad, and I can see here, sitting in Islamabad, as can many, that the Taliban have deviated from some of their very strict interpretations, their version of how they see that the religion should be implemented or Sharia should be implemented. They have deviated a little bit from that. Will they go as far as the West wants of them? I doubt that. I doubt they will do that. They might become a little moderate, like other Muslim countries, maybe, but definitely not as much as the West expects of them. But even the Afghan society, Qudsiya, has changed a lot. And you have this younger generation of Afghans. I'm sure once the Taliban interact with their own people, there will be some sort of a compromise.
All right. Thank you, Ahmed. Now we have another question from Shanza, who is a student of MPhil in International Relations. And she's asking, why is Iran not in favor of Taliban, and what is the national interest of Iran in this matter?
Very good question. Iran is not against the Taliban. Currently, Iran is not against the Taliban. Iran has a very good working relationship with the Taliban. As a matter of fact, if we are to believe previous statements by the Afghan statements in 2019 and before, Taliban actually has some very close working relationship with local cells of the Taliban in western Afghan provinces, which are closer to Iran. In fact, there was also intelligence information about undeclared Taliban office. You know, there's a declared Taliban office in Doha, Qatar, but there were intelligence information about an undeclared Taliban office in Mashhad, the city of Mashhad in eastern Iran, which is the second largest city in Iran, Mashhad, which is obviously close to the Afghan border. So there is intelligence information that there is an unofficial Taliban office I'm not sure if it continues to exist now after the Taliban have taken over Kabul. But up until early last year, which is, I'm talking about May 2020, up until May of last year, 2020, there was good intelligence information from various sources that there is an unofficial, undeclared Taliban office in Mashhad. Now, I have to be clear about something here. When I say there was a Taliban office in Mashhad, I'm relying on public statements released by NDS, which is the Afghan intelligence under the previous government. I'm not sure if they still exist or not under the Taliban. Although the Taliban did announce that they will ask people in NDS and in the Afghan army to rejoin their duties and resume work, and Taliban will work with them and reestablish them. So NDS, as recently as May 2020, and if I remember correctly, it was the last week of May 2020, NDS released in Kabul a press release, an official press release from NDS, the Afghan intelligence, saying that there is a Taliban office in Mashhad. It's undeclared, but it's not necessarily operated by the senior Taliban leadership. It's probably linked to lower-level Taliban commanders on the western parts of Afghanistan, Herat and some other provinces, which border Iran. So Iran had that relationship as well, and it has, I assume, in western Afghan provinces, it has local Taliban commanders who are actually closer to Iran than they are closer to Pakistan. So that's number one. There's another point, Qudsiya, very important, which nobody's discussing really, and I'm surprised, especially in the Western media, but also in our media in Pakistan or even in the region. There's another point, which is why would Iran want to have a relationship with the Taliban? And they have a good relationship, as I explained. So why would Iran want to? You have to keep one thing in mind. Iran is ruled by clergy and their clerics. And the trend right now in the region is to limit the role of militant, religious, militias and organizations in the affairs of states in the region. So there's a trend right now, and that trend began with Egypt, when the Egyptian military undertook a coup against the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt and ended that government. And after that, we've seen a trend in the region where many countries, Sudan, Jordan, Gulf states, all of them cracked down on religious organizations that either have militias or are involved in politics. So there's a trend where people in the region now do not want a role for militant organizations that are based on or claim to represent the religion and taking over countries. For example, the Houthis in Yemen, or the militias in Iraq, or in Syria, or in Libya, for example.
Ahmed, this is such a interesting and long discussion. We are deviating from the topic. I want to focus on Iran's relationship with Afghanistan and Pakistan. We have a question from Aisha Yousafzai as well, and she wants to know. Basically, she wants to know why did the ISI chief visit Afghanistan when we could have sent the foreign minister instead. And she also wants to know what measures Pakistan will have to take to clear its name from interfering in Afghanistan.
Yeah, great two questions. But just to conclude the last point, it's very important. Actually, it's related to Iran, which is Iran would like to have relations with political and militias in the region that are based on religion. Because that legitimizes the Iranian government itself. So you see Iran maintaining a relationship with Hamas, for example, although it's a Sunni Muslim organization, and the clergy in Iran are from the Shia school of Islam. But they have a very good working relationship. Why? There are some strategic reasons, obviously, but another important reason is that Iran's government, being based on clerical and the clergy and the religion, they draw legitimacy from other countries in the region also having the clergy in power. So for Afghanistan to have clergy in power, that also legitimizes Iran. We are not the only one. At that moment, then Iranian government can say, you know what, we are not the only ones where mullahs are in power. You also have Afghanistan. You also have Yemen, for example. You have others. So it's for Iran. Iran will not reject Taliban. Iran would like to work with the Taliban. It's good for Iran. It's good for the optics, and they have a good working relationship. Coming to your questions, these two questions, why Pakistan had to send the ISI chief. It's very important to remember that intelligence chiefs have taken on political missions across the region. It's not unusual. And let me give you 2 or 3 evidences. Number one is the intelligence chief of Egypt, who is the key mediator between Hamas and Israel. Whenever there's a conflict, including the last one between Israel and Hamas, it's always not Egyptian foreign ministry officials who mediate or the foreign minister. It's the head of the Egyptian intelligence or the Mukhabarat who actually does, who travels between Gaza and Tel Aviv and mediates between. So it's a very open role by the Egyptian intelligence chief. Also, at the same time, the Syrian government under Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian intelligence chief, although Syria, for example, has a very, very bad relationship with most of the neighbors, but the Syrian intelligence chief has a very good working relationship, for example, with the Saudis. Or the Saudi government and the Syrian government do not speak to each other. They have a bad relationship with each other. But the intelligence chief of Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian intelligence chief, has frequently traveled to Riyadh and met the Saudi counterparts, and they have a communication among them. Also, Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran and Saudi Arabia have a bad relationship politically and diplomatically. They do not speak to each other. There's no Saudi embassy in Tehran. It's closed right now for the past 5 years. But the Iranian and the Saudi intelligence are in contact, and they meet. Mainly they meet in Baghdad, in Iraq, and they do that frequently. Of course, we don't know exactly when they meet, but a lot of the people in the region know this, that the meetings are being held. So intelligence chiefs have a role in these political issues. It's not unheard of. And do not forget that before Pakistani spy chief, the ISI chief, visited Kabul, the CIA chief visited Kabul and met the head of the Taliban, Mullah Baradar. And so the CIA chief has that role. He was conducting a political meeting with the head of the Taliban. So for the Pakistani ISI chief to do that, it's not really very unusual. Even India and Pakistan, when both governments, when New Delhi and Islamabad reach a deadlock, it's usually the intelligence chiefs of the two countries that secretly help communicate and help diffuse tensions. Either the national security advisors or the intelligence agencies of both India and Pakistan. And sometimes their representatives, as we heard from various sources, they meet sometimes outside India, obviously, and outside Pakistan in some third countries and diffuse tensions between the two governments of India and Pakistan. So always intelligence chiefs do have a role in these kind of very serious political situations. So it's really not unusual for ISI chief to be in Kabul.
Right. Now we have a question from Fawad Ali, and who wants to know about the reaction of basically Saudi Arabia and UAE after Iran's interference in the region. He's asking whether they would think now they have found more space, so best time to have more closeness with Pakistan and Afghanistan to ultimately increase their influence.
I don't see the Saudis really interested. They couldn't care less this time. They're not interested at all. They are not. I don't think they're happy to see Taliban in power. I don't think. My assessment is that the Saudi policy has really completely changed now. They do not favor the idea of a militant group taking over a country. They don't like this idea. They don't like it in Yemen, they don't like it in Iraq, they don't like it in Syria, they don't like it in Egypt, they don't like it in Libya, and they don't like it in Afghanistan.
Ahmed, I think he's talking about, the stance, Iranian stance, especially the way Ahmadinejad reacted on Indian media. I think he's referring to that Saudi Arabia and UAE is going to take advantage of that.
I'm coming to that, Qudsiya.
Okay.
In some ways, maybe the Saudi policy, maybe the Saudi policy could be, Afghanistan could be one of the areas where maybe Iran and Saudi Arabia might agree on some things on Afghanistan. Because, as I said, the Saudis are being very cautious with regards to Afghanistan right now. They don't have, I don't see any active, for example, you see Bahrain, you see the UAE sending delegations to meet Taliban officials. You don't see any Saudi delegations coming so far, getting in. You don't see even Saudi humanitarian planes arriving in Kabul, like Bahrain or the UAE, for example, or even Pakistan. You don't see that happening. Saudi Arabia is being very cautious. Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe Saudi Arabia does not want to incite a proxy conflict of this sort. The kind of, that's basically the question. For Saudi Arabia to exploit the difference right now between Pakistan and Iran, and to get in and get closer to Pakistan. This would worsen the proxy tensions in the region. And maybe the Saudis don't want that. Maybe they don't want to get involved. Or it could be that Saudi Arabia is really is too involved in two things. Number one, Yemen, and number two, the economy and other things, to really decide to jump into the whole mess, which is Afghanistan. So overall, of course, I'm guessing right now, Qudsiya, because you don't see much from the Saudi government with regards to what's happening right now. Yes, there have been some initial statements, and we stand by the people of Afghanistan. We will help them any way we can, and they are in contact. But I don't think that Riyadh had established contacts with Kabul after August 15 at the Taliban takeover. And I'm yet to see, obviously this is a golden opportunity for Saudi Arabia to get closer to Pakistan when Iran is criticizing Pakistan on Panjshir and on Afghanistan. This would be a golden opportunity for Saudi Arabia to get involved. But I'm yet to see the Saudis doing that. They're yet to see. Maybe they'll do it next week. Who knows? Maybe they'll do it next week. But so far, they have not done it. So far. And I'm seeing a very cautious Saudi approach to the new developments. They're watching. They're yet to comment. For example, they're yet to comment on the interim government that the Taliban has formed right now. They're yet to comment on that. There's no comment yet from Riyadh on this. And not from anyone else, really. Not even from the UAE or the GCC or Bahrain or any other countries. Everybody's watching, really. But generally, from the media in the Gulf and the Middle East, I see a very negative coverage of the Taliban. I see a very negative coverage, and maybe it's because everybody is testing the Taliban. They would like to see how Taliban approaches the protests, the women issues, the minorities, the inclusiveness, all of that, and then they will decide. But so far, the coverage is tilting towards the negativity. Mainly, as I said, in the Middle East, they see the principle of a militia taking over a state as a negative thing. But they are cautious, they are willing to give Taliban the chance, and obviously Pakistan's diplomacy here counts a lot. Pakistan has a weight and some influence, and I'm sure, I'm not 100% sure, but I can guess, I can make an educated guess that Pakistan must be definitely at this moment in contact with not only Western countries, but countries in the region. I'm sure also with Saudi Arabia, trying to convince them to engage with the Taliban more and help stabilize Afghanistan. But to your question, and I conclude with this, is Saudi Arabia exploiting the differences between Iran and Pakistan to get closer to Pakistan and so forth? So far, no. So far, no. But this could change in the next few days. It could.
Right. Okay. Remember the first question that we had in this session? The question was, why doesn't Pakistan respond to Iran's untruthful accusations on Afghanistan? Why is this total silence from the civilian and military leadership? This was by Farjad, and now he's given a follow-up question, and he's saying, after he listened to your answer, he's asking, we agree that Pakistan doesn't want to confront Iran at this stage. However, has this policy stopped Tehran from anti-Pakistan activities and collaboration with India?
I think the narrative that Pakistan does not want to confront Iran on things that Pakistan thinks are serious is not true, this narrative. It's not true. Why? Because Pakistan did some things which are very, very harsh with regards to Iran, especially with regards to the IRGC's network in the region. And to say that Pakistan did not respond would be inaccurate. It's not responding in terms of giving out statements, but Pakistan has taken some very serious, harsh measures. Let me give you 2 or 3 measures. Number 1, Pakistan sent an Air Force fighter jet of the Pakistan Air Force, the PAF, to the Iran border and shot down one of the largest drones operated by the IRGC in the border region. The drone was actually not on the border. The drone was inside Pakistan. It was a spy drone. It was a surveillance drone. So it was not an attack drone. It was a surveillance drone. It was for spying on communications and take images of the ground and monitoring on the ground and so forth. And it was operating inside Pakistan, in Balochistan province, obviously. And this was, I think, in the summer of 2017. In the summer of 2017, I think it was June or July 2017. And Pakistan Air Force jet fighter, I think it was a F-17 Thunder fighter jet, which was sent, flew from one of the air bases in, I think in Sindh, and shot down this huge, large surveillance drone by the IRGC. It was a very, very clear message that Pakistan will not tolerate this kind of a violation of its borders and territory and sovereignty. So that was a very clear message. There was another message when Pakistan, a year earlier in 2016, busted the Chabahar network of an Indian active duty naval officer of the Indian intelligence, and that was a very blunt message by Pakistan. And immediately after that, when former President Hassan Rouhani was in Islamabad and he was visiting here, I think it was a very bold move by Pakistan military, not the government, not the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but the military, the ISPR, which openly said that the Pakistani military leadership raised the question of Indian intelligence cells operating from inside Iran, not on the border, but from proper Iranian cities, mainly in Chabahar. But my information is that information was shared about presence of Indian intelligence cells in other cities in Iran. And that was done publicly by the ISPR, very openly, very publicly. And that was a and right in the while President Hassan Rouhani was in Islamabad, and it was done very openly. And I think the Iranian government was not happy with that. President Rouhani was not happy with this, and I think he was a little upset, and he issued a statement even after that. And the Iranian embassy in Islamabad actually issued also a statement. So that was a very harsh response from Pakistan. And after that, in 2019, I think there was a very serious incident in Balochistan where some soldiers from the Air Force and the Navy, Pakistani Air Force and Pakistan Navy, were killed in a terror attack in Balochistan, and the attackers were traced to Iran. And I think the foreign minister, Shah Mahmood Qureshi, actually held a press conference and asked Iran to control its borders and made a very strong statement. And I think this was in May 2019, and it was a very unprecedented actually for Pakistani foreign minister to make that kind of a statement. So Pakistan did take a stand. And finally, last evidence of a Pakistani strong response is when Pakistan actually did sort of crack down on the recruitment network of the IRGC inside Pakistan, which was sending young Pakistanis to fight in Syria. And that network was cracked down. And it was done very bluntly and even very strictly. There were some things that happened at that time which I would prefer not to mention here, because those are sensitive things and people were arrested and so forth. And it was a very harsh response by Pakistan. And a message was conveyed to cease recruitment activities and not send Pakistani citizens to other conflicts. So Pakistan did take very harsh measures. The only thing Pakistan has not done is to indulge in shouting matches. Pakistan has not indulged in shouting matches with Iran or with any other country, not just Iran. We had issues with other countries, the U.S. government, for example, or maybe France, or maybe the EU, and there are some other examples. And Pakistan, usually the Pakistani policy is to convey strictly through either diplomatic or military channels, but not do it in shouting matches and in a very public way, and to humiliate in a public way. But the examples that I just gave Qudsiya and to Farjad, the examples that I gave, I think these 4 or 5 examples are very strong and very, very harsh examples. Give me an example of any other country that shot down an IRGC major surveillance drone other than the United States. The only country that has shot down Iranian IRGC drones other than the United States is Pakistan. It has done that when it happened. So Pakistan did take a stance, and the Iranian government cooperated. And of course, and you know, when I talk about these things, you also, let me conclude also by saying this. We have to understand one thing. Iran's government structure is very complicated, it's very complex. Yes, the government is responsible, 100%, but they also have a system where they have the Iranian government, but they also have the IRGC, and sometimes some things, really, the government is not probably directly involved as much as the IRGC is. So, for example, when President Hassan Rouhani was here in Islamabad in 2016, and Pakistan military raised the question of Indian activities from Iranian soil, from Chabahar, he was upset. But I also heard, as a journalist, when I was investigating this story, I heard that sometimes Iranian government officials like Hassan Rouhani and people in the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs are not aware, really, of what IRGC is doing, for example. So many of them had no idea that maybe in Chabahar there was an Indian intelligence outpost, because that Indian intelligence outpost would not be dealing, for example, with the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They would be dealing with the IRGC, for example, or the Quds Force, which is responsible for, which has taken over Iran's border regions with Pakistan and Afghanistan. So it's really a very complex situation. But Pakistan did, like any other country, no country takes a soft stance when it comes to national security. So Pakistan has taken a very strong stance when it comes to national security, whether it's Iran, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's India, whether it's any other country, whether even if it's the US, when we had issues between the Pakistani and the American intelligence agencies back a decade ago or so.
All right. This is a very complex issue. Yes, you're right. And you have brilliantly tried to demystify it. Thank you for this brilliant analysis. I want you to formally conclude today's session. Just in 2 or 3 sentences, how do you see in which direction Pakistan-Iran relationship will go? Will it go downhill after this?
Right. It's difficult to say it will go downhill because Pakistan and Iran did have many ups and downs after 1979, and they recovered from those ups and downs. So nothing is definitive when it comes to relationships, diplomatic relationships. But yes, Afghanistan has the potential of creating a serious misunderstandings between Pakistan and Iran. It does have the potential. And Panjshir is one warning sign that despite all the efforts that Pakistan, for example, and also Iran did together to work together on the Doha peace process, and they became very, very close. And it would not be appropriate, Qudsiya, for me if I speak to maybe people in the government in Pakistan, in Islamabad, and I repeat those things here. Maybe some of those things are off the records. As you know, we as journalists speak to our sources and people, and sometimes those things are off the record. But I can tell you this much, that there was a lot of optimism in Pakistani government that thanks to the Doha process, the peace process, there has been a very, very good understanding developed between Pakistan and Iran with regards to regional security and in specific Afghanistan. So for this development to happen, this misunderstanding, it means all of that effort that was undertook over the past 1 year through the Doha process really amounted to not much. And the suspicions and the trust deficit remains with regards to Afghanistan. And I'm not surprised because Pakistan and Iran were on opposite sides of the conflict, the civil war in Afghanistan back in the 1990s. So I would say it is not right to expect that the Doha process in 1 year and a half would bring Pakistan and Iran so close so as to overcome the deep divisions that characterize the relationship between Iran and Pakistan inside Afghanistan back in the 1990s, which came to blows, which came very, very close to even direct conflict at 1 or 2 points. It was very, very serious back in the late 1990s. So very briefly, it is a tense situation. It's an indication. I don't think the statements made so far by the Iranian former president Ahmadinejad and the spokesman of the Iranian Foreign Ministry and Tehran Times, this would deteriorate relationship between Iran and Pakistan to a point of no return. Not yet. This is not enough to worsen the relationship to that point. Not enough. But yes, it makes a serious dent, number one. And number two, it does give us a signal that things could be really rough as we move forward in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And inshallah, we'll keep on doing these interesting and informative sessions. Thank you, everyone, and Allah Hafiz.